So we're going to move on to the next question. Can you share your own experience witnessing gender or ethnic-based or other discrimination in workplace affecting a co-worker? Or yourself?
I have an experience that I don't know how to, disclose it really without sort of targeting anyone. But sort of a short story of it is that when I was working as a, more junior doctor, obviously my cultural background is Japanese and, was born and raised in Japan up until, 19 years of age. So I always felt inferior to people who were born and raised in Australia or English-speaking countries, despite the fact that, of course, I've gone through medical school the same way as everyone else did and, passed the courses, passed the exams and so forth. But nonetheless, so coming to my personal experience is that, I particularly on this occasion, I didn't really know what my senior colleague was talking about, and so I just sort of questioned back to the person who was asking me a particular medical question, and then that senior colleague basically said, well, we're speaking English, aren't we? And then that is something that, really, strikes my heart because, it's always, I believe everybody has, some sort of inferiority or inadequacy, that they hide inside of them. And for me, that is that ability to speak English. And, even, now I practice medicine and communicate, well. But that situation just threw me off, and did that really happen? And that really affected me for quite some time. Even during that day, I couldn't really focus on work. After coming back, talking to my friends and so forth. But, in a professional sphere, you don't expect that, your colleagues or senior colleagues to, comment on your ability to do something in front of your peers, that just sort of, affects your performance, even if you're doing okay. So that was my sort of a cultural thing /
Yeah.
So
What a scum.
That's right.
Total scum.
I mean, I'm so sorry that you went through that. And unfortunately, this is something we all witness on a daily basis. The discrimination that you witness, against colleagues who are of different ethnic backgrounds or who speak different first languages or are accented, that is so ingrained in medicine that it is very openly done in Australia. And to be honest, I've seen it less done so in other countries, but in Australia, it's very open that people will make comments about people being overseas trained doctors or, concerns about performance because of their accent or the fact they don't speak English, or questions about their English, even though their English is fantastic and, by objective measure. But this happens quite routinely, and, it is awful for you because the impact it has on you and your performance and your mental health for that time, that energy you spend reflecting on this moment and feeling the suffering and the pain from that moment, when the person who said it has been and gone. And, for some of us, ironically, people will perpetuate this kind of, and let's call it for what it is, racism, in front of me towards someone of a different ethnicity because, but they have an accent. You clearly agree with me. And I'm like, well, actually, no, you're assuming I'm your ally in your racism from ignorance, from a lack of understanding of what the impact is on other people. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is so ingrained to the point that people are willing to write it down on paper. So I review journal articles in medicine all the time because of, my academic interests. And it's not uncommon for people to say, when they send feedback to the author of an article, the paper needs to be reviewed by a native English speaker. And I think how, to put that on paper, instead of making a comment objectively about grammatical or spelling errors and say there are some grammatical or syntax or spelling errors that need correction, the conventional phrase is the native English speaker needs to rewrite or needs to review the paper. And I think to myself, how that is so open. There is no, consequence for this. It's done with such impunity, and it's so standardized, a stamp of, you need to have someone who speaks English read this, without acknowledgement of the expertise or the standing or the quality of the work. It's awful. And it's something, like I said, that fits into this macro aggression kind of paradigm. It's, people don't see it as major racism, but it really is, because it has a significant impact on the individual and those around them.
I mean, in some ways that shows the ignorance of the person making the comment. I've even had comments like that come back from people reviewing my work, and I'm a native English speaker. So, I mean, sometimes, and sometimes it's usually it's from Americans. And then I have to stop and think, have I had some colloquial type language that's more Australian? Or I often wonder if it's about the spelling, because I get very pedantic about making it Australian spelling, and not to give in to that whole idea of being Americanized. So yes, I mean, it's an ignorance on the person making the comment, isn't it? And I'm so sad that that those sorts of comments from people who speak my language can be so hurtful. I'm terribly sorry about that. As a female, and as an older female, I get it all the time. So I grew up in a generation, and I'm really looking forward to watching Annabelle Crabb's Misrepresented, that's coming on soon, because some of the comments in that around, didn't I just say that? Because I'm the only woman in the room, nobody heard me, and one of the mothers is now saying that, so it gets heard. So I probably had that all my life, and I'm short and I'm freckled. So I've always said, I'm female, short and freckled. So they're the reasons that I'm not heard. And the other thing now, as I'm getting older, in particular, I notice a lot of the research finishes at 65, and I'm greater than 65. I notice that people, if they're always asking my age, which irritates me in no end, but immediately they will categorize me into, the useless, they have to yell at me, all sorts of things. It's really very strange how people start to treat you as you age. So again, I guess there's that whole gamut, isn't it, of biases within society that people are just unaware of.
But I think even if it's happening all the time doesn't mean it can't be called out. And I think
that's right.
Remembering there's a structure to how to call it out as well, and it becoming a routine thing to call out these things that are happening all the time.
But also, I guess through my experience, this Hey Boss project is also standing on this, growth out of adversity. That aspect, through my experience, I know, as Nada, you said, a lot of international medical graduates come here to practice medicine or get registered and so forth. And then I've witnessed so many times that they were basically humiliated in front of other patients and so forth. And then in those circumstances, after my experience, I can, even though I'm not the kind of person who had the power to stand up and say right out then, towards that senior colleague who might be degrading that person, but I can definitely have a confidence now to really step aside and, just sort of passively support, as you said. It may not be something big, but emotionally, I think that's really, really helpful. And I certainly felt that, emotional support from people who were there for me to be able to listen and then, sort of share that hurt feelings and, the experience. So
I would say that the most powerful way to be able to support a person of a minority group or someone who's less privileged in any environment, including patients, is to say, I believe you, I see what happened, and validate that experience, that it was wrong, that it was unfair, because most of the mental energy that goes around these issues for people in those circumstances is not knowing if it actually happened or not. The what you just said, which is, did that just really happen? Did I make this up? Is this in my mind? Am I internalizing a sense of inferiority, or did I manufacture this experience? Or am I making too much of it? Because most of the time you are gaslit into thinking, no, this is not about race. No one is trying to be racist. No one is trying to be sexist. This is not happening. And in general, that is the messaging we receive in society, in our community. So a lot of our energy goes into trying to figure out if this is real or it's not. So, the moment a colleague turns around and says, I saw that was wrong and I'm sorry, that means everything. Half of the time you spend wasted is gone now. And it's a feeling of being seen and heard in a passive way, but it's not actually passive. It's actually very active to acknowledge and validate someone like that. It's very powerful.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to that skill of speaking up and challenging the status quo, if I think about in medical school, what kind of exercises or training, training things we have to teach junior doctors to challenge another doctor, the only example I can think of is when you see a doctor about to, for instance, administer the wrong drug or make a medical error, and the stakes in that scenario are they could really hurt a member of the public. And they train us in that really serious scenario that you should use graded assertiveness. And you should start off by, politely inquiring if they're really sure that that's the right drug first, and then, move up from your really passive stance from there. But that's when the stakes are someone could potentially die. And so when it comes to everyday microaggressions, we're trained that even in a life-threatening scenario, we should very politely ask the senior doctor to check first. Or ask them to repeat what they said or what their intent is. The graded assertiveness curve is just not enough at all, and in terms of teaching us how to question the status quo, or overrule a senior.
What gives you confidence when you speak up? What style of speaking up do you think you're able to make ground with most? For example, some people might get angry, walk away. Some people, as you did, Saki, was to go into yourself and hardly be able to concentrate for the rest of the day. Some people can use humour and deflect it and see it as the other person having the problem. So, there are lots of strategies and skills that people can use when these sort of things come out of the woodwork at them. What have each of you found works for you in terms of being able to deflect and not allow that comment to be given credit?
I love a long silence.
Yeah.
A long silence while I stare at someone. Yeah. Incredulity.
I think, for all of my confidence and my ability to articulate how I feel, every time I've experienced a microaggression or a macroaggression, I had never been able to speak. And I'm in my mid-40s. It has never happened that I've actually heard what was said, experienced it, and had a comeback, because it's always a shock. We're conditioned to believe that this is not something that happens in our environment. And we internalize that conditioning. We are told there is no racism, that it doesn't exist, right? The sexism doesn't exist. So when it does happen, it's so confronting that I'm always left speechless, and I have to remain silent because I'm essentially stunned and I don't know what else to say or how to say it. And it comes later. So I take it away, and like Saki did, reflect on it, agonize about it. And develop these skills of, calling Dom, this happened. And she'll say, that's real. Or I'll call another colleague, a shared friend of ours, who'll say, yeah, that wasn't right. And that's how we shortcut those painful experiences, by engaging with others who share our experience, who identify. And to be honest, it's never with a white colleague, I have to say. I haven't found that white colleague that I can call and speak to and say that to. And so I think, the humor, the kind of coping strategies that people use when in the face of insults and stuff like that, they're usually for smaller things. People can make really silly comments sometimes, and it's very easy to deflect. But I think racism is so brutal, and when you said, people can die at the error that somebody's making, racism is so painful for so many of us, because there is a generational trauma that gets invoked every time this happens. Right? Like, it's not just that moment. There is a history. There is pain and suffering for some of us that it goes beyond just the individual. And so that can be too hard to shrug off or to deflect. It needs a much more, I guess, supported process.
I think from my original comment, I think what I want to get out of it is I want to see doctors in medical schools shown how to respond to when they have statements or actions, aggressions directed towards them. And we don't know what to do in those awkward moments. I can only speak as being a female doctor, but I've certainly had moments where I've had really rude and ignorant things said to me, and I've had no clue how to respond.
I wouldn't necessarily think it's you that necessarily has to defend yourself. I think it's also training supervisors and management about how they should respond in that situation as well. I think the RECP, they are trying to build in, part of coaching for supervisors about, I think they are trying to make an effort at least to, how they might respond in these situations, but there's probably more that could be done.
Yeah, I think in medicine, I don't know whether it's because I work in medicine, but there's a lot of division, right? So people are either categorized into like winners and losers, or like often like the phrase that I hear a lot is like, he's a gun, or like, what's the other word?
Shark, I've heard shark.
Shark or something like that, celebrating these qualities, right?
Or a gun, or
yeah. I'm like, how is it good to be a doctor? We're in the business of caring, and be a shark or a gun. Like, why are we celebrating these qualities?
I don't want them taking care of my grandma.
Yeah, but the number of times, like it happens, number of times that I sit in MDTs listening to these inappropriate comments, and the frontliners laughing at these inappropriate comments and just kind of giving them the death stare from the back, and they can't even see me, right? And then I'll go home and I'll steam about it, and then
and then you'll call me Dom.
Yeah, and then I'll call you and you'll be like, oh, I can't believe it, scum, But the person who did that doesn't even know,
No, they're oblivious. And so this is the thing, right? I find in Australian culture, it's actually very difficult to speak out. And one of the things I noticed when I moved here 20 years ago was that, racist humor, homophobic humor, sexist humor was just normal. And there was, being PC was a negative thing. So, we should be able to laugh about these things. And it was so pervasive that it was very hard to challenge that common cultural sort of colloquial way of dealing with these issues. Only now that I'm older that I have, I guess, the audacity to say, actually, why is that funny? I don't understand the joke. That it makes actually people so uncomfortable, and perhaps a week after, people will just not avoid me a little bit and be really careful with what they say. But I think that needs to happen more and more, and it will happen more and more if there is that diversity, there is that representation, and if those people are supported enough and nurtured and in their environment to be comfortable to call it out. At the moment, there's too much at stake for people to call things out, unfortunately. And it's really important to train allies, as you mentioned, in medical school. How do you be an ally? How are you an active ally? How do you be an anti-racist? And I would encourage people to read some of the works of, you know, so many amazing activists out there who have articulated what is expected of an ally. How do you become an ally? It takes deliberate work and training. So as a medical professional, you have to do that. If not for yourself and your colleagues, for your patients, because we look after a diverse range of people, and we cannot afford to be implicitly or unintentionally hurtful, because our motto is to do no harm, and it's not okay not to know that you're doing harm.
I think it's hard work to challenge challenge up, to push up and people that are set in their ways. It's hard work to challenge that. But what we can change is the ones that we're supervising. And I think that's as important as challenging the status quo, is encouraging those that are entering the workforce that there is a different way to think about and do things.
Yeah, and I think education and giving people the tools to use in these situations is the key, because, like, you know, if you think about it, a lot of the times the individuals that are targeted, they're targeted for a certain reason, because they know, well, the person who's attacking knows that that person won't have a comeback, or they'll just take it, you know. Like a good example is when I finished my exams, somebody else who had finished their exams was looking for a fellowship and emailed this workplace who was actively looking for a fellow to then become a consultant in a particular specialty. And now this individual wrote back to my friend and said, oh, if you're thinking of taking maternity leave in the next 3 years, then you should really not apply. And this individual wrote this in an email, and I thought to myself, oh, that would depend on, she would not be writing this email response to everyone. It would be very selective. And I said to my friend, look, you need to do something about this. You should make a formal complaint. And she was like, oh, just let it go. And I was like, this is the problem. This is the problem, because they know, they send this stuff, they hurt you because they know that they'll take it. And so we need to equip people to do the right thing.
There's no consequence.
No consequence.
The fact that people are willing to put it on paper is astounding to me. People are willing to put their discrimination on paper means that whatever rules or laws that we have not really been enforced. And so there is no obvious or visible disincentive or consequence. That needs to change. I would encourage anyone who's listening today to watch Picture a Scientist on Netflix. It is phenomenal, because I think it goes through the history of why these issues are still pervasive in STEM and in medicine included. And the need to actually organize, the need to come together, so that, acknowledging that if something like that happens, or somebody receives an email like that, that email has gone out to many other people. And that, that microaggression or macroaggression, whichever way you want to categorize it, is happening in perpetuity unless someone says something. And you don't have to be that person, but you may need to engage with a colleague or a senior or a supervisor to help you resolve it. We need collective courage.
It sort of comes back to that question last week. Who do you go to? Who do you speak to when you feel there's an injustice that's been done? How do you, if you're in more senior positions, train the people under you, the people who you're mentoring and supervising, and making sure they know? It's like in my situation, I give people the numbers that if they're in distress between the times that they're seeing me, whom they can get in touch with, or what organisations. So it's sort of a bit like that, isn't it? Handing on to those below you, making sure they know who they can speak to and where they would take complaints to.
It's building that model. If we build a model that works, others learn from that. So I guess that's one thing we can change. I mean, one thing we can change is working on our own practice. Yeah.
Yes.
I think medicine as well is when it comes to these HR issues of just clearly an inappropriate comment made in the workplace. It's really not common practice for doctors to go to the HR of either of their private company or of the hospital. And hospitals are such huge organisations, and any other big business in corporate, you would have a clear line of HR support, and you'd be able to have someone else's performance assessed by an objective party. And that's just not something that's done within medicine.
There's no accountability.
No accountability.
That's something very depressing. We're going to create the accountability.
And I know it is there because I do know of a situation recently where in one of the health districts, someone wanted to come out into their intern year part-time, and they were told in a meeting that this just doesn't happen. We've never done that here in this particular health area. But they did say, you know what, if you want to push for this, this would probably come before the, this is an equity issue, and I would probably have to accept your application. So I think the knowledge is there in the upper echelons that there are people perhaps looking downwards at them, and that the bravery of the younger doctors coming through to create change should be encouraged.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's so crucial to have policies or a system in place where the decision makers aren't all the same people. We need to have diversity in every level of medicine, every level of decision making, because people bring in their different values and different lived experiences, and it has a major impact on the people coming up. Because if you have only vanilla, should I say, oh, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? But if you only have one flavor, like at the board, then you don't appreciate other flavors. And life is better for other flavors, isn't it? Yeah. Yep. So people say it's being PC, like, having diversity quota and things. But I think it does actually mean something. It's a step towards something. And, without that, you cannot make a start.
I think, as a doctor, we have the artistic side of what we do, which is look after people, and we're social beings, and we belong in a fraternity that is designed to do good. So there's a lot of value that comes from that. But as scientists, I think sometimes we forget that, the whole point of being a scientist is to be inquisitive, it's to inquire, it's to collect information, it's to look at objective outcomes. And if the objective outcomes is that, in 2021, the majority of the workforce in senior positions or in leadership is still the same as it was in the 1950s, something is very wrong. And the reasons why that is, or the factors that have contributed to this, need to be observed, they need to be counted and redressed. And we're ultimately all scientists. And I appeal to the scientists and my colleagues when I try and engage them in these conversations and say, sure, you don't believe racism exists, that's fine. You don't believe that that sexism exists, that's fine. But I need you to look at the data, and let's talk about the data. And, this is one strategy I have for those people who are denialists, because I think that is soul crushing when someone says your experience is invalid. So, I think for juniors who are struggling or who think that there's no way around this, I think you can always appeal to the scientists in most of us to try and engage in this conversation.
Well, this around this topic, now that's a good segue for the next question that we have. So in your own career so far, do you think there has been a shift in the medical community to celebrate diversity and inclusion? And if so, in what areas have you seen positive change, and what are the barriers that you experience to improve our workforce?
Big question.
Very big one.
Question. I'm going to try and be short enough so that I'll give lots of opportunity for other people to speak, because I'm conscious that I've spoken a lot. I have to say celebration is a step too far in Australia. So celebration is more forthcoming in places like Canada and in the US, where they're more naturally complimentary, more naturally effusive in their language. And the recognition of social justice movements in medicine has really quite flourished. People are elevated because of their background, their lived experience is valued, they're, you know, promoted and pushed, and whenever they achieve certain things, it's celebrated. That's not to say that racism doesn't exist, because it does, but that celebration is something I'm seeing more frequently. In Australia, that celebration does not exist. It's more of a kind of a denial, and when you're there, it's, oh, good for you, you've been meritorious. And so I think the barriers to celebration, I think, are cultural. So I think in medicine, we're quite privileged. You know, we all have to acknowledge our privilege. You know, as people who work in this profession, we're economically advantaged. We are in a position of knowledge. And I think we have a moral obligation to be socially active and move this conversation more openly in our culture, in our societies. We need to be open about this, because it's very rare that I see Australian doctors speak in public forums, extremely rare, but I have a feeling that we must, because the impacts on health go beyond our own environment. They really do affect people and patients we look after in our communities.
Yeah, I can only speak to my own experience, really. But I think there probably has been a shift. I guess even from the start of when I entered medicine, my year, I think, was the first year there'd been, you know, in terms of representation, a majority of female entrants into my medical class. And I think it's tricky, because I come from New Zealand. I immigrated from New Zealand to Australia in 2006. And, you know, there is a contrast between, I guess, celebrating Indigenous health strategies. I know that in New Zealand, for example, they've just established a Māori Health Authority that runs alongside. So it's dedicated top-down strategies to manage Indigenous health, which we really don't see that as much in Australia. It seems a really foreign concept to embrace Indigenous culture in our own way of working. Although that might be changing. I know there have been, you know, grants to support Indigenous workers that we are seeing. For example, in our own hospital, NADA, I think you do see some new positions established that are dedicated for Indigenous support. And I know, you know, there is some superficial representation for LGBTQI, you know, sending floats to Mardi Gras from our hospital. So, you know, there are some superficial representation strategies, but I think really the actual engagement of things that are going to change, I think, would be the next step.